Hi everyone, today we're working on quadratic functions. We're going to review some quadratic functions and their applications. So starting with what is a quadratic function? So that's going to be any function that has the x squared in it. So basically a degree 2 function. If you've got an x squared term and no other degree higher than that, then we're a quadratic function. And we know quadratic functions from the past. They have graphs that are parabolas. So either facing up or facing down. And one of the key points to find on these parabolas is the vertex, right? The vertex being either the highest point or the lowest point. And we can find a vertex by a couple methods, but probably our best method is using the formula negative b over 2a. So where we use the a and the b from the actual quadratic equation. The quadratic formula is used if we want to figure out where that quadratic is equal to 0. Lots of times that's useful in finding x-intercepts. And let's see, completing the square is an option, and technology, of course. All right, so let's just look at some examples here. So this first example, we're going to be solving a quadratic equation. So you see this equation 2 minus 4x equals 3 over x squared. So we've talked about equations that have fractions in them before, and really the main goal is to start by getting rid of the fractions. And so to do that, we're going to multiply this equation by the LCD, and the LCD of this equation would be x squared. So we're going to multiply both sides of the equation, every term, by x squared. Think of it as x squared over 1. And that's going to clear out the fractions in this equation. And then that'll allow us to solve it easier. Okay, so x squared times 2, if I distribute here, x squared here and here, that's going to give me 2x squared minus, now when we take x squared times 4 over x, remember the x squared is like an x squared over 1. Whoops, sorry about that. Let's bring that back. And then we can cross cancel an x on the top with the x on the bottom of the 4. And so what we'll be left with there is just a 4x equals, and on the right-hand side, that x squared over 1 cross cancels with the x squared on the bottom, and we just get 3. All right, so this quadratic is now in a better form. To solve it, we're going to get it equal to 0. So we're going to move that 3 over to join the 2x squared and the minus 4x. So to bring that 3 over, we're going to subtract 3 and bring that over here. So we have minus 3 equals 0. All right, so we always get our quadratics equal to 0. Once we do that, we can either try factoring, see if our quadratic factors by the AC method or whatever other methods you like for solving quadratics. I'm going to use a quadratic formula here because I'll just save you a little bit of time and tell you that this does not factor. So we're going to use our quadratic formula. And so to use the quadratic formula, we identify the A, the B, and the C that we're going to plug into our quadratic formula, which is up here. Okay. So plugging that into the quadratic formula, here we go. X is going to equal negative b, so that's going to be negative 4, plus and minus the square root of b squared, so negative 4 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, negative 3, and then that whole thing divided by 2a. So again, here's a good place to stop the video and keep going and work this out for yourself, and then come back and kind of check with me. Okay, so as I keep going here, x is going to be, this is a double negative on the 4, so that's going to be 4 plus and minus. Now inside my square root, if I just type that in my calculator, watch out for the double negatives and so on, you're going to get a 40 in there, and that's all divided by 4. Simplifying the square root of 40. So I'm going to think of 40 as being 4 multiplied by 10. So when I simplify, I'm going to have 4 plus and minus. The square root of 4 is 2, and the radical 10 stays there, divided by 4 here. And then again, to reduce, you can reduce if you factor. So in the numerator of this, I can take a 2 out. If I factor out a 2, then I'll have a 2 plus and minus a radical 10 divided by my 4. And now I can cancel. So I'm going to cancel this 2 here and cancel a 2 into the bottom. And now I've got some answers. Now, the directions did say give exact solutions and, if appropriate, decimals to 3 places. Okay, so let's get the exact answer. So reducing here, I end up with 2 plus and minus the radical 10 divided by the 2. So let's write them as 2 separate answers. You could write this as 2 plus radical 10 divided by 2, and then the other answer 2 minus radical 10 divided by 2. All right, those are the 2. These would be the exact answers, right? Now, if you like, then you can type these into the calculator and get yourself a decimal approximation. Okay, so just getting the calculator out, using the fraction button, and we can get decimal versions of these. So let me tell you that 2 plus radical 10 divided by 2, let's see, I want to say that's going to give us that 2.581. And then we have this other answer, which is going to give us a negative 0.581. So be sure you practice typing that into the calculator. So these would be our approximate answers because they have been rounded off. Okay, so these are approximate answers. So we have exact solutions in yellow there and the approximate solutions in green. And again, you just have to, in the homework, it depends on the directions. If they say exact, then you leave them in the radical form. If they say you can approximate, then give it as a decimal. And in the homework program, at least 3 decimal places, and I think sometimes 4 they prefer. Okay. Now you may be wondering, let's take a quick look at the answer. If you have 2 plus radical 10 over 2, some students are tempted to cross cancel those 2's out, and that you cannot do. What you can do, if you like, is you can take the 2 on the bottom and divide it into both terms that are on the top. So if you prefer, let's see if I can write this correctly here. You could split it like this, 2 over 2 plus radical 10 over 2, and then you could write the answer in this version, 1 plus rad 10 divided by 2. That's a different version of the answer. But as far as trying to cancel just the 2's out, that would be illegal, right? So this answer here would be acceptable as well, all right? Okay, so there's a good practice with the quadratic formula and also getting rid of fractions in equations again. All right, let's look at example 2. Example 2 being an application. Great practice. So we have the cost to produce X dog houses is given at this cost function, and the revenue, oh, I see an R is missing here, and the revenue function is also given. So they give us a cost function and a revenue function. Make a little mental note here that X represents the number of dog houses, and the C of X and the R of X are dollars. Okay, so it says find the profit function. So let's start with that. So remember, profit, P of X, is always revenue subtract cost, revenue minus cost. Okay, so if we're going to take and subtract here, be sure you use parentheses. Negative 3x squared plus 1500x, that's our revenue, minus from that the cost, 150x plus 135,000. So notice the parentheses because I'm going to make sure that I distribute this negative here. Okay, so that negative distributes to the 150 and the 135,000. All right, so my profit function. Let's see, negative 3x squared. If I take that 1500x and subtract 150x, just use a calculator, you end up with 1350x. And then again, distributing that negative to the 135,000 minus 135,000. thousand. This is my profit function. Okay, and I want to ask for profit function, be sure to include the equation P of X equals, and here's the answer. Okay. All right, part B says, what quantity is the smallest break-even point? Okay, we've talked about break-even before. You can find break-even, probably the easiest way, by setting the profit equal to 0. So that's what we're going to start with here. So if we want break-even, what we're going to do is we are going to set our profit function equal to 0, and that's going to find breaking even. Okay, and breaking even is the quantity, it's the X value. So, all right, let's take the profit function that we just found here, and we're going to set it equal to 0. And then we are going to solve it either by factoring or by the quadratic formula again. Let's see, could we divide everything by 3? Could I downsize these terms a little bit? I kind of think they do, because those are pretty big numbers. Let's see if we could divide everybody by -3 here. Maybe get some smaller numbers. Now, so long as I divide both sides of the equation by -3, that's perfectly legal, right? And so it does divide. That'll give me a positive x squared. Let's see, minus, if I divide there, 450. Okay, 450x. And here's a double negative, plus 45,000. Well, that gives me a little bit smaller numbers, and then 0 still over here. All right, so you can use the quadratic formula again, or you can do factoring. I'm going to help you out a little bit and tell you that this does factor. But again, if you don't figure out that it factors, you jump to the quadratic formula. Right, so x and x, I'm looking for a pair of numbers that multiply and make 45,000. So my thinking would be this, okay, what multiplies and makes 45,000? I know that's so big, and adds up to -450. Okay, and those are kind of big numbers, but it does work to say we could use -150 and -300. 150 times 300, 45,000. Okay, and those would add up to 45. Okay. All right, again, I'm going to show you in a minute how you can also use your calculator to help you with this problem. So I'll come back to that, but let me finish up. So let me set these factors equal to 0 and finish up solving here. Because remember, I'm looking for x. So here I get x is 150, and I also get x is 300. Now the question said, at what quantity, so the x value, is the smallest break-even point? Okay, so 150 is the smallest one. And remember what X stands for. Remember back here, we said X is dog houses. So I'm going to answer this question using words. The smallest break even, I'll just say quantity, is 150 dog houses. Got to label your answer. So when you sell 150 dog houses, you are going to break even. Your profit is going to equal 0. Or if you prefer to think of it as your revenue is going to finally equal your cost. Okay. Okay, we've got a couple more parts going. Part C, find the loss or the profit when 200 dog houses are sold. Okay, so they're telling us that X is 200. Figure out if that gives you a loss or a profit. All right, well, I'm just going to plug that X value into the profit function. So I want to find P of 200. All right, so this is just a calculator problem. 200 plugs into profit. Use your calculator, right? So I'll write it, but again, it's just going to be using your calculator. So 200 goes in for the X in your profit function. 1350 times 200 here, and then subtract, and what we'll subtract is 135,000. All right, plug 200 in your profit function and you will get a value. And if it's a positive, then we know there's profit. If there's a negative, then we know there's a loss. All right, and what I come up with here, and again, pause the video, plug this in your calculator yourself. I get 15,000. So remember, this is money. So I'm going to give you some words here. The profit when selling 200 dog houses, and here it is label this money, $15,000, right? So applications, you give answers in words. So this is perfect. We've given the answer to the question, right? It says find the loss or profit when 200 dog houses are sold. I've answered that. All right. One last part, and we're getting a really good review of quadratics, all kinds of things with quadratics here. What is the maximum profit and when does this occur? Okay, so now remember our profit function is a quadratic. And if you notice, this profit function has a leading term of -3, right? It's -3x squared. So if the leading term on your quadratic is negative, that means what the graph of it looks like is this downward parabola like this. So this is what your profit function looks like. Some downward shaping parabola. So if you want the maximum of this, what you are looking for is the highest point. And so that maximum on that quadratic there is going to be found by finding the vertex. So basically problem part D, I have to find the vertex. Okay, so I gave you a formula. Look back at the box in yellow, and there's a formula that says, hey, if you want the vertex, you can use a nice quick formula. The x value of the vertex can be found by -b dividing by 2a. Now, what's the a and the b? They're in the formula, right? So let's go to our profit function. Remember the -3, that's our a. 1350, that's our b. So I'm going to plug those numbers in. So -b, so that's going to be -1350 divided by 2 times the a, which is -3. So you put that in, you put it in your calculator, you calculate it. Let me see what we get. 225. Now remember, the vertex is an ordered pair. It's a point. So the only thing I have so far is the x value of the vertex. The x value is 225. What you still would have to do is get the y value, right? I still need the y value. Well, the x value represents the dog houses. So now I know that to get the max profit, you're going to have to sell 225 dog houses. But what actually is that max profit? Well, take the x value, plug it back into the profit, and get the y value that goes with it. So you need to take your x value of 225, plug it into the profit equation, and get the y value, which is going to be the profit. So again, just like we did a moment ago, use the calculator, plug your 225 in, and then answer the question. All right, so I put that all in there. Let's see what comes out. So when x is 225, the y value is, let's see, 16,875. Now remember, that's the money. 225 is the dog houses. So I'm just going to answer in words. It says, what's the max profit? When does it occur? Okay, so how about we say it this way? When you sell, because you have to sell them to make profit, 225 dog houses, you will achieve the max profit of is $sign 16,875. That answers my question. So finding a vertex is usually something we do when we're looking for, say, a max or a minimum. Depends, right? Some quadratics you will have a minimum. All right, so here we have it. Looks good. Okay, we've got one last problem, I think, to go here. And then I think we've got it. Let's see. Let's bump down to the next one. Oh, yeah. Another profit, revenue, and cost function. Let's get this guy set up. Let me leave that for a second so you can see that in case you need it. All right, so example 3 is where we're going to stop. We're going to do one more, and then I think we'll be good. And example 3, I'm going to show you how you can do the quadratic formula using your calculator, okay? Because a lot of these problems, we don't need to do all the algebra on them. We need to set them up and use technology lots of times. It speeds things up, right? Okay, so example 3, we have a company. They're going to sell X units. Okay, so X is the quantity of MP3 devices. The price per unit in dollars is given here. So look, little p of X, that's a price function. All right, let's make sure we make a note of that. That is price. Okay. They also determine a one-time startup cost to be $3,000 with a cost to produce each item of $20. That's like a variable cost. So they're giving us a fixed cost and a variable cost. Okay, find the revenue, cost, and profit functions. All right. Yeah, this is getting tough, huh? Well, let's start with cost. C of X. So remember, X is units. So the cost they said is a one-time startup cost. So fixed cost $3,000 and a cost to produce each unit of $20. Okay, so $20 times each unit, so 20X. Plus 3,000 to set it up. There's our cost function. Revenue. Now revenue, remember, revenue we've mentioned before is always the quantity, which in our problem is X, multiplied by the price, quantity times price. Okay, so we know here quantity is X, price is the function that they gave us, this little p of X. So the price is 1,000 minus X. So to get my revenue function, I'm going to take X and multiply by 1,000 minus X. So, all right, here's revenue. Revenue is going to be 1,000X minus X squared. All right. And once you have cost and revenue, you can find profit, right? Because we've done this a bunch of times now. Profit, P of X, is always the revenue function, R of X, minus the cost function, C of X. So I just need to do a little plugging in. So revenue we have is 1,000X minus X squared, minus the cost, 20X plus 3,000. Okay, let me bring that up a little bit over here so you can see that better. So I'm finding my profit function, P of X, revenue minus cost, reminding you again, parentheses, so that you distribute your negative. All right, so let's simplify the profit function. So the profit function, I'm going to put the X squared first. So it's going to be negative X squared. 1,000X, take away 20X. That'll be 980X. And then distributing the negative to the 3,000 minus 3,000. All right, I've got them. Let me highlight. I've got cost function here, a revenue function here, and finally the profit function here. There's the first part of the problem. Now, if you don't get those correct, none of the rest of the problem is going to work. So we have to really make sure that when we're finding these functions to get us going, we don't make any mistakes on them, right? Because they're key to all the rest of the problem. All right, so part A, we've got it. Part B, find P of 200 and interpret. Okay, that's not bad. That's just plugging in a number. All right, P of 200. Just take 200, plug it in the profit function, right? Okay, so a little caution on this. Be sure you try this yourself. When you plug the 200 in, remember we always plug in using parentheses. So when you write it down, be sure to write it that way. And when you put it in your calculator, put it in that way. So the negative goes outside the parentheses, and then the 200 plugs in squared, 980 parentheses 200. So I would type this in my calculator the exact way that I wrote it down here. And so this should come out to be, let's see, P of 200. Looks like 153,000. So that's a good amount of profit. Again, you have to try typing this in. Don't just assume, it's easy to do. It's not. You can easily make mistakes on calculators if you don't practice. But I do have to do the interpret part. I've got to write the answer out. So 200 is the X value. So that's the units. So I'll start by saying that. So when 200 MP3 devices are sold, the profit will be, and that's the number I got here, $153,000. So always writing your answer in words with the appropriate units on them. Okay. Okay, part C, what is the maximum profit? When will it occur? Okay, that is just like the last problem we did, where we are going to find the vertex. Okay, so I'll set that up. I think you'll be okay with doing that probably mostly on your own. So find the vertex. If you want the maximum, remember again, this profit function is a parabola that faces down like this. And so if you are looking for a max, you are needing to find the vertex. And so we're going to, for part C, use the formula X equals negative B divided by 2A. All right, and so again, the A and the B come from the profit function because we're finding that max of the profit. So let's see, the B is 980, so I have negative 980 divided by 2 times A. A is the leading coefficient, negative 1, right? That's the number in front of X squared. Okay, so the X value turns out to be, let's see, negative divided by negative is a positive. I want to say 490. Yeah, 490. 490. So remember, X is units. So 490 units will be when you get the max profit. What actually is the maximum profit? So remember, we have to get the ordered pair. Let's get the Y value that goes with this X value. So you're going to plug 490 back into the profit function for X and get the Y value. Okay, 490 back into profit. Get your calculator out, put that thing in. And I will tell you that what you get there is this guy, 2, 3, 7, and 100. So that's my max profit. So max profit is $237,000. Well, 237 and 100 when 490 units are sold. There we go. That answers that. Okay, part D. I am going to show you about your calculator and how your calculator can do the quadratic formula for you. Not always do we want to have to go through all the steps of the quadratic formula. I want to speed it up many times. So again, there's 2 calculators that I recommended, scientific ones, and they do this. So again, the calculator that I prefer, let me go back up here to that calculator, is this TI-36X Pro. So on this calculator, you will see a button here that says Poly-Solve. To choose any of those light blue keys, you have to use the second button first. So what you're going to do is you're going to, clear out everything on the window, hit second, and then Poly-Solve. And then what will pop up on the screen here will be a choice of a quadratic. You'll see something like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 on there. And you'll choose that. You'll hit enter. And then it's going to give you a prompt to enter A. You enter a number, to enter B, and to enter C, just like you would in a quadratic formula. So you could enter them in the calculator. Then you hit enter and it will give you the solutions. Hit enter again because there's two solutions. So you enter the first time, it tells you x1 equals this. Enter the second time, gives you the other x value. So use the poly-solve button. All right. So again, I encourage you to use this. The only time this is not great is if they want an exact answer. See, the calculator will always give you decimals, but decimals are fine for problems involving money because we want decimals for money. All right. Okay, again, you have to play around with that calculator. Not all calculators are the same. And if you're not using one of the recommended ones that I've given you here, your calculator probably doesn't do this. Okay. All right, let me go back to our problem. One last thing, and then we're done here. All right, it says how many units must be sold to reach a profit of 69,000. So they're telling you, hey, the profit is 69,000. What you have to do is find the units. So you have to find X. So I put 69,000 for the profit. So 69,000 equals, and then your profit function, negative x squared, 980x minus 3,000. So I put 69,000 for the P of X, and I'm going to solve for X. So let's get this equal to 0, and then we will use our calculator. Let's move 69,000 over to the other side here. Or if you like, move, everything over with the 69,000, either way. So I get it equal to 0, negative x squared, 980x, and then this is going to be minus what, 72,000? Yeah, 72,000. I have to think about that in a minute, 72,000. All right, so I'm going to suggest quadratic formula, practice using your calculator. Now, you can try factoring too, but we want to practice all the tools that we have. So remember, A is -1, B, 980, C, 72,000. So we're going to use the quadratic formula on our calculator. Okay, use it on the calc. So again, you have to type that in. Okay, practice using that. And then what will come out of this will be two X values. It'll tell you, hey, X1 is 80. And it'll tell you, hey, the other X value is 900. It's going to give you the two solutions to the quadratic. Okay, now again, if you don't have that calculator, then you'll have to run through the quadratic formula by hand. All right. I recommend the calculator. It's going to help later on too. All right, let me go back. What was the darn question? How many units must be sold to reach a profit of 69,000? Okay. So to reach that profit of 69,000, we have to sell 80 units. Now you can also sell 900 units, but you're going to reach that profit first when you sell 80 units. Okay, so I'm going to put that in words. So you will reach a profit of $69,000 when you sell 80, and I kind of forget what these were, MP3 devices. So maybe I'll just say 80 units. Okay. And that answers the question. Great, we got it. Okay, so example 4, I'll leave that to you, but this should give you pretty good review of your quadratics and quadratic functions. All right, until the next video.